believe that these Gospels, these New Testament documents, were written by not just by eyewitnesses, but from eyewitness testimony. And then, okay, so after eliminating all those, you get to the resurrection, which is the only thing that explains that why there was an empty tomb and why the disciples saw Jesus, why he appeared to them. So let's look at some miracles. A lot of people might say, okay, so miracles don't really happen, so therefore the resurrection happened. So let's look throughout the world to find maybe some miracles that did happen. So here's the evidence, and certainly we can't say that we can't scientifically test that God is behind these miracles, because all you can do is present the facts, and then you have to understand from the facts, you have to draw the conclusion that God is behind this. But here is what is a bleeding statue in Cochabamba, Bolivia. And it's a crying and bleeding statue. People have witnessed it crying and bleeding, and they've videotaped it. They've done an x-ray where they've tried to identify if there's anything inside creating the crying or bleeding, or anything on the outside which is causing the crying and bleeding. They can't find anything. And what they found is they sent in the blood into the laboratory, and they did an analysis on the blood, and they found that it had human characteristics, in that the blood actually had epidermal cells. It wasn't just dried blood from somebody else, it was found epidermal cells, which are skin cells. So if you were to rip off a scab, you would have some skin cells on your scab there. And so that's what they found. And they noticed that there was a high count of white blood cells, which indicated that the person was under a lot of stress, or the person was tortured when this sample was taken. And then one peculiar thing that they found out about the blood was that it didn't have a genetic profile. And what that means is, if you were to take some of your blood and you were to look at it, you'd find a genetic profile which indicates who your parents are. And this blood wasn't anyone that they couldn't find, that they couldn't discover the parents. So this blood couldn't really have been just a random person putting their blood on the statue and then that getting taken and analyzed by scientists. That blood came from somebody without a genetic profile, apparently. And this is religiously significant because it's a statue of Jesus. It's not a statue of Winston Churchill or FDR or anybody like that. It's a statue of Jesus. So it's religiously significant. And that connects to a couple other miracles that we're going to talk about. But let's move south to Argentina, Buenos Aires, Argentina. So there was, in Catholicism, we have the doctrine of the real presence. So when the priest during Mass says, "This is my body," to the Eucharistic host, the host turns into Jesus Christ's body, blood, soul, and divinity. All right, and it's not as if the carbohydrates from the bread turns into protein, as in flesh, but it retains the same form of bread, but it turns into the body of Jesus Christ. The essence is Jesus Christ. And you can see that in some of these miracles here. For example, this miracle of Buenos Aires, Argentina. You have the flesh. The Eucharistic host fell on the ground. It was an abandoned host the priest found after Mass. And the protocol is you either consume it or you put it into a cup of water and stick it in the tabernacle and empty the water a few days later after the host has dissolved. Well, what happened was, a few days later, he found this host, and it had some red liquid on it. And so eventually, after time, the liquid kept accumulating. He took the host and he sent it into the laboratory, not telling the guy receiving it what it was. And so the scientist was able to determine that it had a couple of things very peculiar. First, he said it is human tissue, and it comes from the right atrium of the heart. All right. So if you're familiar with the heart, that's a certain part of the heart. It's a very specific part of the heart. You have 2 atriums and 2 ventricles, and it came from the right atrium of the heart. And they found that it was from a living person who was under stress. There was a lot of white blood cells that they found, so they determined that that person was under a lot of stress when the sample was taken. And once again, this tissue had no genetic profile. We'll talk about more what that means later. But let's head over to Italy. In Lanciano, this is one of the most famous miracles. 8th century AD, you had the priest who said Mass, and he said, "This is my body, this is my blood," and the Eucharistic host and the wine turned into real flesh and real blood. And this, the scientists tested this in 1970, and these are specimens that are over 1,200 years old. And they determined that the host was a right atrium of a heart, and it was the blood, when they reinvigorated it, it's dried blood currently, but somehow they reinvigorate it and they test the blood and it's freshly shed blood somehow, miraculously. It's 1,300 years old, but somehow it's freshly shed. And then there's no preservatives within the blood. There's not a trace of preservatives that's keeping this blood alive either. And when they matched the DNA from the host in Lanciano, it turns out that it's from the same person as the one in Buenos Aires. Very shocking to kind of see that all come through. So that's Lanciano. And those you can go and see. If you were to go to Lanciano today, you could go see that. I've heard people say that you can see the blood vessels in the tissue of the heart, and it's really an amazing miracle to see. So then we'll go a little bit north to Turin. Maybe you've heard of the Shroud of Turin. It's the alleged burial cloth of Jesus of Nazareth. And there's a lot of studies out there. There's all these videos about this. It's very famous. But what you have is, here you can kind of see the image here. This is what the shroud looks like. This is the face. It's a lot bigger, but I wanted to put these images up here because that's what I wanted to talk about. Because there's no scientific explanation for why there is a face on the shroud. Nobody knows. You can see that the blood here from something that went into somebody's head and caused that person to bleed.